Great.
Cool. All right. Welcome to another episode of the Meaning in the Middle podcast. I'm Landon, as always.
And I'm Ryan, as always.
Ryan, tell our listeners and viewers about our very special guest.
Well, I mean, I've been really excited for this one for a long time. I think since we first started talking about bringing other people into the conversation, Suzanne was one of the first people that came to mind for me. And Suzanne, you know, a lot of times when people have guests on, they kind of run through their credentials and their titles and awards that they've won. But I've always found it more interesting to ask people how they like to talk about themselves. So how do you like to explain who you are?
Thank you for that opportunity. I'm not particularly interested in the other things that I often am introduced by. I first of all would say that I'm Joe's wife and that we've worked really hard to build a marriage that makes a healthy place for our children to grow up. And now we try to model behavior in terms of aging for our adult children. We have 4, and they range in age from 34 to 44. And Joe and I are trying to age well because we feel like that's the example that it's our time to set for them now. It was a different thing at a different age. And we are trying to be dependable and present and affectionate with our grandchildren. And we're trying very hard to let their parents parent them in the way that they do. And we just get to be part of their life. All of our children went away and they all came back and they all live in the Dallas area. And all of our grandchildren are here. So there are 19 of us. And we are a lot. And we are really doing well with one another. And so that's how I spend my time, along with working to learn new things about the Enneagram and doing some writing. And so since that's how I spend my time, that's the only credentials that really matter, other than we did not invent the Enneagram Godmother. Somebody else started calling me that. And so we took it. And that is the other piece of how I spend my life.
Right. So I'll try to be as brief as possible of my engagement with you and your work, because I can wax poetic about this. So I'd say like 6 years ago, I had hit a wall, and it was like that recognition of burnout that comes right before you actually hit burnout. I was feeling very unmoored and not really sensitive to what was happening within me. And so with the blessing of the elders at my church, of which Landon was one at the time, way back when he was a Christian, I took sort of a stabbatical. I continued on with Sundays and kind of regular meetings, but I really slowed down engaging with people in the community and some of the other parts of my work to figure out what's going on within me. And years prior, I'd become familiar with the Enneagram in very general terms, and it seemed interesting, but not particularly vital. And in that season, I really started to engage with this theory, trying to figure out what was happening within me. And there were a lot of really beautiful revelations in that month that as I started to do the work, I was becoming more sensitive to what was happening like beneath the surface of my own life. And over time, as I began to internalize this whole theory, and it helped me to kind of crawl out of that kind of period of pre-burnout and helped me become a little bit healthier. It also started to become something we talked about in our community. And this is around the time where, it became a little bit buzzy. And I know you've talked about that a lot, which I really appreciate, but we've persevered through it, and it's really become an integral part of our community. It's become a huge part of what I do in my work. And then I had opportunities a couple times through a mutual friend of ours, Corey, who was one of the students at my ministry school in Nashville, like 12 years ago, to come and hear you speak and spend a little bit of time with you and Joe, once in Nashville and then once, I think it was at Duke. And I remember the first time I met you, you held my hands and I just started crying because it was there was something about your presence that it was more than what I like about the way that you approach the Enneagram is it's more than just an interesting theory, and it's more than just a structure. It's about people, and it's about seeing people love themselves, and it's about seeing people love God and about loving other people. And it's been instrumental to me through that process. And so to get to talk to you today is a really great honor.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for being with us. Yeah.
You're so welcome.
So Landon, why don't you talk a little bit about like why we wanted to have Suzanne on? That normally we talk about ideas, but there's this whole other conversation that's kind of come up through this project.
Yeah, I think in our kind of first season of the show, it's easy for us to tackle these kind of large, almost impersonal concepts. We talk about God in one episode and truth, and we try to solve these things in 60 minutes or whatever. And it feels like we're slowly kind of ratcheting down to talking about ourselves a little bit more. And I think the kind of closer seems to be this dynamic where the more you kind of press in to these seemingly big ideas of meaning and truth and friendship and relationship, the kind of closer you get to yourself and you realize that the exploration really is of you and of the people you're engaging with, right? That those concepts don't really make sense when they're completely abstracted or when they're really devoid of connection. And so I think as we've pressed into that, we've really recognized that that's where we're headed and that's where we are. And so the Enneagram has proved to be really useful language in that pursuit of ourselves as individuals, but also in the way we relate to other people and the way we understand each other, and given a ton of language for this thing. I think that's for a lot of people, and maybe we'll just start by saying, and Suzanne, you might have some other ways of phrasing this, but the Enneagram, for people who are not familiar, in its very basic sense, is a kind of typing system. So people will be familiar with Myers-Briggs or some of these other kind of personality typing systems. The Enneagram, for a lot of people, will fall into one of those categories. It has important differences, but lines people up in these 9 numbers, 1 through 9. I am a 5. Ryan is a 9. And there's, for a lot of people, the first time they sort of discover the Enneagram and learn about their personality type and how that relates to motivations, it unlocks language. It gives you this like, okay, yeah, I always knew that about myself, but didn't know how to say that, didn't know how to explain that to other people, or the language kind of unlocks a certain perception. And so for us, yeah, it's been super useful. Like you said, it's been really instrumental in the community and even in my marriage, understanding some of those dynamics that can feel like they're underneath the surface, but it really shines a light sometimes and gives a certain amount of clarity. So yeah, I think for us, the reason this conversation is so important is because it's such a direct look at that kind of, at those fundamental questions about our motivations and our relationships, and that really functions as this kind of foundational cornerstone for a lot of these philosophical ideas that we love to dive into, but trying to kind of pull it down into something real. And yeah. And you're the person to do it with.
Well, thank you.
How do you like to, well, how about this? Like what has this whole thing meant to you in terms of relationships, especially, even as you said, like generationally, like the world has changed and is changing so rapidly. What has this meant to you in terms of being able to maneuver a relationship?
Well, I'm an Enneagram 2, so relationships are kind of my thing to begin with. My way of talking about the Enneagram is that it's 9 ways of seeing. And one of the reasons that I think it's so important in relationships is because if we all lined up at a fence that we could just barely see over, everybody, if we stood 20 feet apart, everybody would see something different, all facing the same way, looking at the same field. Some people might see birds. Some people might wonder why there are no trees, all the things. And when I used to, it's become kind of second nature to me because I've been doing this for 30 years. But I used to say to myself when I felt like I was in conflict with somebody else, or when I thought somebody else was an idiot, or when I thought somebody else was ridiculous, of course, I was always right. I began to think, regardless of what it was, they don't see what I see. And so we're not responding to the same thing. And it's causing distance between us. And then what has to happen is people along the fence have to be willing to share what they see, rather than not say what they see, but just take apart what you see. And trendy Enneagram is a problem for me. It's a gift, but it's a problem.
Sure.
Because the Enneagram can't be reduced to 10 questions. It shouldn't be reduced to what kind of salad do you order in a restaurant, depending on your number. It shouldn't have anything to do with Halloween. It shouldn't. It should be held as spiritual wisdom, because that's what it is. And you can go deeper and deeper and deeper if you do the work. And if you don't, then this tool is probably kind of not for you. It's not supposed to be a parlor game where you identify people and then you think you know them. So people come up to me frequently and say, like, after you've been at a dinner party like we had tonight and you meet somebody new at that party, do you already know their number? Well, the answer is, of course not. And I would never think that I know their number. That's their work to do, not mine. And so if we could recognize that it's a much bigger gift than the bow that's on top, and that there are all kinds of things on the inside of the Enneagram that go far beyond I'm a 5, I'm a 9, or I'm a 2, then we could begin to work on ourselves in meaningful ways.
Yeah.
And people ask me what the difference is between the Enneagram and the other quote unquote typing systems. And the difference is you can do something with the Enneagram. I'm an ENFJ on Myers-Briggs. I've known that since I was 19 years old, and I don't have any idea what any of them mean except the F. I feel everything. Otherwise, I don't know what to do with that. I'm an extroverted extrovert. So for me to work toward so I could be an introvert isn't going to happen. So this wisdom changes relationships by its very nature for people who use it to work on themselves.
Right. Yeah, it's one of the things that I have really appreciated about the way that you teach it. It feels like right now we're in this era of, there is a new emphasis on self-discovery, which I think like our generation and younger take for granted, that maybe your generation, it wasn't necessarily always there, like that interest in knowing yourself. Like, so within the Christian household, for example, like it was interpreted, deny yourself and take up your cross means ignore yourself, just focus on Jesus. And any interior work is inherently selfish. And it feels like there was kind of an emotional stunting there for a while. And it's like the pendulum has swung the other way, where there's a tremendous interest in self-understanding. But a lot of the pop psychology, and I don't think this is local to just the Enneagram, but it was the flavor of the the month for a while there, is that I find out, I gain this language for who I am in the same way that I gain my, Hogwarts wizarding school Patronus or whatever. And it ends up becoming more of an excuse than a reason. It becomes a box that I put myself in, and just as dangerously I put others in, rather than an opportunity for growth. And I wonder if when you zoom way, way out and you have this amazing perspective of having taught all over the world, leading cohorts, leading workshops, what is this cultural moment that we find ourselves in where there is this desire for self-understanding, but where it kind of gets stuck? Like, how do you see that?
I think that the more choices you have, the more self-aware you are.
Okay.
So I think one of the reasons that previous generations to yours, which isn't mine, is that there just weren't a lot of choices. So my generation, my mother's generation, women were friends with women. They were close to one another, and they told each other their stories, and they had coffee once a week, and they were friends. My daughters have opportunities to be friends with women. But my generation, we were the first women in the job market to be competing with men for the same job. And we were competing not only with men then, but there was only going to be one woman hired to 10 men. So we were competing with one another. So in my generation, we were more competitive than connected in friendship. That's one example of, I'm sure if we had an afternoon, we could come up with hundreds of what happens, but it has to do with choice. And the more choices you have, the more opportunity you have to be with different people who are different from you and who are doing very different things. And I wanted to coach college basketball. That was what I wanted to do ultimately. And when I was in high school in the mid-60s, that wasn't likely. But my parents, because they were older when they adopted me, I think, and because they had traveled so much, saw the world much bigger than most people in the town that I grew up in. And they continually said to me, you can be anything you want to be. My friends didn't necessarily hear that message, especially my male friends who were expected to stay there and farm with their fathers like their fathers had farmed with their grandfathers. So then I think the question we might want to explore is, what's the value of all these choices, but what's the downside of all these choices?
Right.
And to just tip my hat to what you said about how we put people in a box and all the Enneagram talk, let me just say this thing. When people don't trust the Enneagram because they say they don't want to be identified as one way or one number, they don't want to be put in a box. My answer is, I'm just going to teach you the box that you're already in. And my goal is to help you see beyond the box, because other people are not in your box.
Yeah.
And the idea that we can do this relationship building quickly is a false idea. It takes the kind of things that you two have been through as friends to build a relationship that you know you will have in 50 years. And even though you have changed a lot since you became friends, and you now have to base your friendship on something different than you originally did, that's much more trustworthy, having done the work y'all have done, than being in the room with people who are just like you and calling that friendship and thinking you've really got so many friends you don't know what to do with them.
Yeah. It feels like we've talked about it in the sense of like, it feels like we've kind of come from a monocultural moment, which is like, you know, it's like you're a Lutheran, I'm Lutheran, everybody's Lutheran.
Right.
And do we all believe the same thing? Yeah, do we believe in God? Yep. Do we all believe in freedom? Yep. Good. Got it. You know, and something has shifted, maybe the advent of the internet or being more globally connected, or just recognizing that a lot of those, I don't know, systems aren't really serving us anymore, that we have to move away from uniformity. But that's where I think a lot of people just feel really scared by how big and confusing the world has become. And I know, like for Landon and I, I'll tell you, I'll poke fun at Landon a little bit with
Please do.
how this all went down. So there's three of us and we're best friends. Mark has moved up to North Carolina with his family. It was about 4 years ago, probably next month. Landon texts us and he says, "Hey guys, I just want to let you know, I've been doing some research and reading over the past 6 months and I don't think I'm a Christian anymore." It's like, wait, what?
Oh.
Wait, huh? What happened? Where did it go? And so the next year and a half was, first of all, us being quite perturbed that he didn't include us in the process or ask us any questions. But
I
also
dispute that was the very first communication on the topic, but
it wasn't the very first, but it was still a shock. And, you know, so for me, because I value togetherness so much, it was this relational crisis of like, well, what is this founded upon? Like, where are we at? And especially because now a lot of the dynamics of our relationship had turned to, I never questioned who he is for a second, but like, well, how are we going to relate? How do we hold this together? And we had to do a lot of conflict that I think always began with intellectual questions or religious questions. But we kept hitting these walls to a certain degree, and how we were doing that. And like, okay, there's something else that we have to address. This is all great and it matters, and we love talking about this stuff, but we've got to do this other stuff as well. And that's what I think that's what a lot of people are experiencing right now. You know, that we are in, I just had a conversation yesterday with Brad Jersak, who's written this book where he kind of calls it the Great Deconstruction, that the world has changed so rapidly that a lot of us are scrambling to catch up and say, well, what do we do? Do we continue to bury our heads in the sand and continue to believe like, no, I've got it right. You know, we maintain unity through purging the heretics and the people that don't think and do things like us? Or do we learn how to open up to a more complicated world, or complex rather, maybe that's a better word, and continue to reprioritize what actually matters in relationship? So I'm curious, like, through your work, what do you perceive are some of those new skills that we need to develop to live into a polycultural world where we can't take it for granted that we all come from the same place?
The first two that come to mind, one is easily understood and the other one maybe not. But the first one is curiosity. One of the things y'all have going for you is that you're both curious. By nature, you're curious. Not everybody is. And there's no way to make it without a great deal of anxiety in the world the way it is right now. There's no way I know other than to be curious or to accept the answers that other people are giving you. And there doesn't seem to be a middle road there. Mm-hmm. And people have big platforms and big audiences and are charismatic. And people who aren't curious by nature just take in what they say and write it down. And then that's how we ended up institutionalizing Christianity and Judaism and all of the other religions. And once we take a belief and turn it in, or a belief system, and turn it into an institution, then that's where we begin to lose the belief. Joe, my husband, is a former Roman Catholic priest, been a United Methodist pastor now for a long time. He was ordained 49 years ago. And he says, without hesitation, in relationship to Christianity, Jesus never intended to start a church. That was never the goal. It was never part of what Jesus was about. And now we have 39,000 distinctively different Protestant denominations worldwide. And we didn't divide over important things. We divided over the color of the carpet in Fellowship Hall and whether or not we were going to have communion by intinction or little cups. Like it's all of the stuff that people are not curious about that we divided over. They're just opinionated. Richard Rohr's definition of opinions is underdeveloped thinking. Isn't that good?
Yeah,
that's so good.
great.
And curiosity is what leads us to developed thinking. But I'm going to throw in some Richard Foster here, who probably wrote this in the 70s. And he said, the new tools of the devil are muchness, noise and hurry, and muchness and manyness. There's another word, but I'm 72 and I don't remember what it is. And crowds, maybe. And it worked to keep us from being curious. I'm not one generally who talks about the devil. I'm like, I don't know about that, and I don't usually say anything about that. I'm quoting him. But in quoting, or I'm poorly, because I can't remember the other word, but still, that's who I'm quoting. And the problem that we have, I think, culturally, then, is with noise and crowds and hurry and muchness and manyness, and that's correct. We don't have time to be curious, and we don't have time to build relationships. We want to have them, like we want to have everything else. I want to have it. And then we name it, and we think that worked. And it doesn't. So an example that I would give you then is we're going to have to slow down. We're going to have to deny ourselves some things in order to be faithful to a few meaningful relationships. And then stay in those relationships, even if there are dramatic changes like the one that has happened among you guys and your other friend, Mark. And if anybody leaves, it threatens the belief system. So Landon leaving threatens the whole thing because he has reasons for saying, I don't think I'm a Christian anymore. And the church talk answer to that is, we'll pray for you. Well, that's not what Landon's asking for. He's not trying to come back and be Christian. So if you're going to pray for him, pray for you too, that there can still be understanding, growth, and relationship between you by being curious about how the other person sees. Because I would guess, and this is a guess, that there are a lot of questions posed to Landon about why are you not a Christian anymore? Not as many people on the other side being willing to answer the questions, why are you still a Christian? Because I've always been? Because what? Like, what is your answer? What is anybody's answer for still being Christian with an atheist? And where we find ourselves is on our side of the fence. We just don't feel like we have to answer. And to be in relationship, we do. So I believe that we are going to have to do more with less. And I think it's a good thing for everybody to have the courage to examine what they believe at some point in their lives, instead of just continuing to move forward without any curiosity. Yeah. As you might imagine, in my work around the country, I meet a lot of people who have left the church because they were hurt by the church. And this is a really big statement that I probably am going to regret saying. But I wish the church knew the Enneagram so the church could make space for every number, because she doesn't. And I wish we as Christians were followers of the way of Jesus instead of identifying with institutions and the way of the institution. Because I think Christianity would be much more desirable if we were able to do that. There are some interesting statistics available because of COVID that I think are Enneagram worthy. And my husband is a pastor at First United Methodist Church in Dallas, so it's a big church. And when they first started having Sunday morning worship online because of COVID, people watched it live online. And then they watched it on, after months, they found that the same people watched it on Tuesday or Wednesday. Mm-hmm. And then they found that the same people weren't watching. Or they were watching some preacher somewhere else who they liked better. Or they were, right? Yep. And I think it's tricky, and I'll tell you why in a minute, that the church is losing people and that Christianity is losing people. And at the very same time, I think this evaluation that is called for is going to be really helpful for my grandchildren. For some years now, Joe and I have talked, Hunter, who teaches with Joe, Hunter Mobley from Nashville, and Joe and I have talked about doing an event called Thinking, Feeling, Doing Church. And for people who aren't very familiar with the Enneagram, those are the 3 centers of intelligence that define the 3 triads on the Enneagram. So 3 numbers are thinking dominant, 3 numbers are feeling dominant, and 3 numbers are doing dominant.
Each represented in this conversation, ironically.
Yes. Or because the universe wants it to be that way, as opposed to perhaps irony.
Hey, or divine providence.
I'm very concerned that we are grouping in those 3 groups. It's so comfortable to just be with people who approach life the same way you do, and so very limiting.
Yeah.
But if you aren't curious, you don't ask why other people approach life the way they do. So you never have the conversation. So you never get excited about maybe doing something a little bit different. So all of my work in my 3rd book was about balance, about being able to approach life using all 3 centers of intelligence, thinking, feeling, and doing. And that's hard work, and it's doable, but you have to work at it every day. And then what happens is it expands your space for relationships, but at the same time, it constricts how many real relationships you can accommodate.
Which I think is, in the era of social media, that's a hard pill to swallow. Because I think so many of us have been conditioned to breadth of relationship, that you're supposedly relating with 1,500 people at the same time or whatever it might be, but so much of that's an illusion.
Yeah, the language I have, not me, Suzanne, I'm quoting. I have 1 million followers. Really? Where are they following you? Like, where are you headed? And are they following you to where you're headed? So it's very interesting to me that we chose that language.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm real clear that there are a lot of people who read Joel's good work of my work on social media, but they're not following me. They're not doing what I'm suggesting or what I've done, right? So we weren't even careful with choosing those words because we just use words. We just use them. So I think we have some work to do around that. And Landon, tell me where you are in your journey. Like, I think we have to believe in something bigger than we are. Otherwise, self-absorption is the next step after self-awareness, and life is really tricky. So what do you believe in? What do I believe in?
Good question. I guess go ahead.
Well, just wait a minute, 1 second, because I want everybody who's listening to notice that I changed my question. Because I was about to define what you believe in by saying, do you believe in fill in the blank? And because I'm working on this, I caught myself and turned the whole thing into a question so that you're not limited by my multiple choice question.
And I appreciate that. I believe in relationship and in community. And I think, right, sort of obvious metaphysical differences that Ryan and I have and that we might also share, I think have become a little bit separate, right? Like those are interesting and they're important, and I try to still engage and stay open to possibilities in those areas. But I think so much meaning and just value and beauty is really, even in those other kind of belief systems, is all really grounded in that space of committed relationship and in community. And so yeah, I guess that's how I would answer it. I think with like Ryan and I, we started that relationship with like, hey, we agree, and so we're together. And then there was sort of this phase where it was like, hey, we disagree and we're together. And that's sort of like the disagreement in a weird way was the bonding thing, right? Where it's like, oh, he's the pastor and I'm the atheist. And like a lot of our engagement was about kind of trying to not debate so much, but a little bit of that kind of like some of that was just testing our own positions. But there was this like, it was anchored in that difference in a sense. I feel like we've moved into this other phase of like, well, actually we're just together, and the agreement and disagreement part that's not central. And so I think I've found a lot of, I don't know if I found a lot of truth in that kind of starting there and then thinking about those other questions seems to work for me.
Yeah.
So the way then that I could connect to that as a Christian, if I wanted to build a relationship with you, would be to say, well, actually, the first followers of Jesus all started a community, and they lived in community with one another. And that was what Jesus started. And then communities became churches, and then they had rules, and then you couldn't belong to the community because you didn't follow the rules, and on and on and on that goes. And the reality of adding Enneagram wisdom to that is to say, when I'm starting to teach people the basic Know Your Number workshop, I say, Joe and I do a lot of work. I'm quoting what I say now. Joe and I do a lot of work to try to get people to see what we have in common. Enneagram work is about seeing how you're different. And that's why you got to listen while I talk for an 8.5 hour day about every number, because knowing your number is helpful to you. Knowing every number is helpful for the community and the wider community and the wider community. And once you know every number, it's not cocktail talk anymore. It has to include some curiosity by nature.
Yeah.
And then once you understand a little bit about the other numbers while you're learning about you, you have a responsibility in relationship to treat the other person like they want to be treated. So the golden rule is out the window right there. Because other people don't want to be treated like I want to be treated. Joel doesn't. He's a 7. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you is lovely. Treat others like you want to be treated is lovely and limited. And, you know, if I took your lost childhood messages, Landon, of yours being, it's not okay to be comfortable in the world. So you're usually not. And Ryan, you want your life to make a difference. You want to feel like you have a place. You want to believe that your presence matters. So right there, you two have given each other the answers to your lost childhood message by staying in this relationship. And if we could change in the culture, let's agree to disagree, to let's agree to try to see how the other person sees, then we're building community. Agreeing to disagree is a head trip.
Yeah.
Yeah. It feels like the temptation, like one of the answers that we find a lot of time in culture today to this increasing multiplicity is, just cutting people out,
exactly.
Like that's the default is like, okay, well, I think it probably started as like, that's like a conservative fundamentalist trope, but those people raised a whole other generation of people who aren't conservative anymore, but still think in those terms of like purging. And it's like, get rid of the people who don't do this, that, or the other thing for you, it just, we can't survive,
Yeah.
We can't.
And that,
go ahead, Landon.
Well, I was just going to say it relates to what Suzanne was just saying about agreeing to disagree. It's like the reason that doesn't work or is destructive is because it's static, right? It's taking the curiosity out. It's saying, hey, you're stationary, I'm stationary. Let's just get over that and ignore it, instead of saying, hey, I'm moving and changing and you're moving and changing. Let's just participate in that kind of dynamic process together and not make, like, the positive intent of it sometimes is like, let's not make the disagreement a deal breaker, which I think is good. But if you frame it as this kind of static, well, you're there and I'm here and whatever. You definitely, like you said, it allows you to either cut people out because what else do we have to say to each other? And it doesn't keep that invitation open, which I think is super important.
Well, and tolerance just seems such a low bar and not particularly interesting.
Yeah. Tolerance is not acceptance.
Yeah.
Beyond tolerance is a really big question. What is beyond that?
Right. Yeah, exactly. But that takes stepping into unknown. And it's like, I think a lot of us, when I think about speaking of the Enneagram as like different ways of seeing, we become so addicted to staying within the confines of what we already know and value. And it's a threat to have to come out from that. And I've found it, I'm sure Joe has as well. Like, I feel blessed in a way that to be a 9, it's a little bit easier for me to get out of that and see from other people. But I know, like, for me, the crisis in my relationship with Landon was really coming to terms with and maybe this doesn't make me a very good pastor. I was like I care what Landon believes, but I kind of don't. It's not, I don't need him to agree with me, but the anxiety rises up in me if I perceive that the disagreement is going to lead to a break in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's usually where I could see it in like a lot of relationships or people within my community or people who have left. I don't want to talk about the thing. And I have this sixth sense. If I can perceive that you're asking me a question about a doctrine or an idea, or you're trying to debate me on theology or ethics or whatever, if I can smell that you're doing it to draw a line in the sand, I don't want to go there. And what has been so reassuring to me in this whole process with Landon, even though we get annoyed at each other a lot, is I don't smell that anymore. Like, oh, here's Landon's line in the sand. If I admit that we don't agree on this thing, he's going to break relationship and he's going to leave, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And that's
very 9 of you.
Yeah.
Right. Conflict avoidant, like anything but conflict. I just don't want any conflict.
Yeah.
And you know, Ryan, it's a lot to have the responsibility for in conversations about Christianity and about God. You have an awful lot to answer for.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's very big. And I don't think we understand a lot of it. So since we don't understand all of the mess, what we have to do is understand each other and just say, we're in this for the long haul, and then build on things that you do agree on.
Mm-hmm.
What's required, interestingly enough, which is problematic in some ways for the two of you. What number is Mark on the Enneagram?
He's a 2.
Okay. So I'm going to teach for a minute. 2s, 3s, and 4s are feeling dominant. And that means when they receive information from the culture, they feel first every time. 5s, 6s, and 7s think first. 8s, 9s, and 1s, doing is dominant for them. Now, the next line, though, is that one of the other intelligences, central intelligences, supports the top one. The problem is one of them is repressed.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that are required to build community cannot be addressed in a healthy way, as far as I'm concerned, unless you bring up your repressed center. That's Enneagram. That's where the magic of Enneagram work is.
Mm-hmm.
So for the two of you, as a 5 and a 9, you're both in the withdrawing stance. 4s, 5s, and 9s are in the withdrawing stance. So that means you tend to withdraw rather than move toward. You both tend to back up. And it means you're doing repressed. But what you have to be careful of is that without doing something, y'all can have the same conversation for the next 35 years.
Yeah. Shots fired.
Right? And that isn't going to hold forever, that same conversation.
Yeah.
So you have to decide what you're going to do with it. So this is one thing that you're doing with it. You have this podcast and you're doing something with your difference. But don't let the podcast soothe you in a way where you don't think you have to keep doing other things about the difference in how you see the world.
Yeah, that's good.
And we're all going to have to figure out how to have integrity in our number and be the best we can be there and be part of something that isn't everything we would love for it to be. And your generation kind of has gone on to say, this is what I believe and this is what I'm going to do with my life, and I get to do it no matter what. And that's not true if you're going to be honest and have integrity within community.
Yeah. Yeah.
So think about what your church would be like, Ryan, if everybody knew the Enneagram, and if all of a sudden everybody wanted you to preach to, teach to, set up learning opportunities for, balancing the three centers of intelligence of thinking, feeling, and doing. Then would your people have the courage to sign up for the class that involved their repressed center?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so since y'all are both repressed doing, even though, Ryan, you're repressed dominant, and you're dominant and repressed is the same thing. But what that means for you, Ryan, is that when you walk into a room, first of all, first thing that happens is you know what needs to be done. The problem is you don't think it might be yours to do. So you just kind of say, somebody ought to do something about that, because that's a problem.
Yeah.
And Landon, your problem is you research and investigate and read books and plan to do the thing, but you plan more than you do.
Yep. I produce podcasts for a living, and we have a client at work who does this like achievement like index, and execution is one of those. So it's kind of his way of, maybe in a business sphere, aiming at some of these centers. And I took his test as a way just to understand what he's doing, and I was 0% execution. So, and he said that was very unusual. So I hear
hilarious.
You loud and clear.
Yeah,
Oh
so you got that?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Okay, well, I just want you to know that I have 5 minutes left before I have to do another podcast. But and you don't have to invite me back, but I would love for us to continue this conversation.
Okay. Yeah, we would love that. We would love that.
Because I think the Enneagram is made so that we can have it is in the world. It isn't made. I think the Enneagram exists so that, using my language, so Landon, forgive my language, so that we can build community with people that God puts in our sphere, rather than eliminate them one at a time.
Yes. Yes.
The Methodist Church right now is a mess. It's a mess. And it started out disintegrating over ordination of and presence of the queer community and same gender marriages. And it ended up being about power.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because it was always about power. But there had to be some bones to hang the angst and the discord on. And so in our culture, in quote unquote Christian culture, in some denominations, it was okay to hang it on the bones of the queer community and believe that somehow that was a good thing.
Yeah.
And wonder what would have happened if church leaders had met with people who were struggling, belonging in the queer community and trying to belong in Christian community at the same time. And everybody I know is looking for belonging. Everybody I've ever met wants to belong. And everybody I've ever met wants their life to have meaning. And so, Ryan, I think rather than it just being us getting rid of a person because they don't fit, we're now have expanded that to setting aside, distancing ourselves from groups of people. And we all know how that's going to end.
Yeah.
We know. And yet we're marching toward that social war anyway. So Richard Rohr says either everything belongs or nothing belongs. I think Jesus said the same thing. And I think the Enneagram will help you, whoever you are, immensely if you will do enough work to learn to manage your dominant center and to bring up your repressed center, because you can't add balance to community unless you have balance in your own life.
Yeah, that's great. Suzanne, thank you so much. It's incredibly honorable for us to be able to sit at your feet, to talk with you, and to hear some of your wisdom. And yeah, we'd absolutely love to have you back on and continue this conversation.
Well,
yeah, for sure.
I'll put it on your side, but let's check in again in about 4 months.
Okay. I will write that down. 4 months.
It is really a privilege to be invited into your friendship for this hour. So thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Talk to you soon.
Right.
Okay.
See ya.